Hello, good morning friends, and welcome to Sandhan. Today, for this 1 hour, we shall talk about T.S. Eliot as a poet. As we all know, T.S. Eliot is the most important literary figure that influenced literature on a large scale during the 20th century. He was a genius, a multifaceted personality. He influenced English literature and literature in general in far more ways than any other single individual ever did in history. He was a poet, he was a critic, he was a dramatist, a very influential figure. Today, I have with me Professor Bansriben Kakkad. She is a senior lecturer in Dharmendra Singh Ji Arts College, Rajkot. And also I have with me Dr. Anil Kinger. He is also a senior teacher in P.D. Malavya Commerce College, Rajkot. Both of them are very senior teachers and have been teaching English language and literature for many years. So I am glad to have them with me to discuss T.S. Eliot as a writer, as a poet, as a dramatist, as a critic. We shall see all three aspects of his personality during this 1 hour. Friends, when we talk about T.S. Eliot, we have to consider a large span of time, because he covered a very large span of time in his active career. He was born in 1888 and he died in 1965. So he covered almost 2/3 of the 20th century. So his influence and his contribution to English literature, English poetry, English criticism, English drama is immense. And it is indeed very difficult to sum up his contribution or to sum up the area of his influence, the extent of his influence on English language and literature in 1 hour. So we shall concentrate more on T.S. Eliot as a poet. We shall have an idea of his drama. My friend Dr. Kinger shall talk in detail about T.S. Eliot's drama. But for the major part, we shall concentrate on T.S. Eliot's poetry. T.S. Eliot, when we refer to T.S. Eliot, we immediately remember the best known poem of T.S. Eliot, that is The Wasteland. I may say it is the poem which has influenced literature in general in such a way that it is truly an avant-garde event of English literature or literature in general. The poem was a trendsetter. It changed the way we look at literature, we look at poetry. It changed the way in which poets used to write poetry. So a very significant, seminal work, we may say, that influenced English literature, literature in general, we may say. Before we go to his poetry or individual poems of T.S. Eliot, I think it would be pertinent to take a look at the overall poetic scenario of the period in which T.S. Eliot was writing. His The Wasteland was published in 1922, and it was composed immediately after and to some extent, in a sense, during the First World War. So the memories of the First World War were very fresh in people, especially in Europe. And The Wasteland reflects this strong sense of destruction and decay and degeneration that crept into European civilization, and the disillusionment brought about by the calamity of First World War. But more than that, it would be too facile, and it would minimize the importance of the poem if we say that it reflects the atmosphere of post-World War European civilization. It is more than that. The poetic scene of the period reflects so many more things. We shall see in detail about the various characteristics of modern poetry as such when Eliot came into the scene. It was a poetry of a different world altogether. The world had changed a lot, especially the change started, as we all know, with the French Revolution and with the beginning of industrialization. And the whole of the 19th century saw a rapid and vast expansion of industrialization and technological advancement in England. And then we find that by the time we reach to the 20th century, we see a society that was different. Modern society. And another word that we often associate with and we often hear in with reference to this modern poetry or modern literature in general is modernism. So how far is this poetry, modern poetry or poetry of the first half of the 20th century reflect this idea that we call modernism? That is very important for us to know. But for that, the first thing that we should keep in mind was that it was a society that was now beginning to perceive the effects of industrialization in Western civilization. The first effect of this was, of course, perceived very strongly in the city, in the large cities, in the metropolises, as we say. And modern poetry is basically poetry regarding or pertaining to or reflecting the people and their anxieties and their problems that they experienced in the city. So more or less, of course, there were we shall see that there were poets who were writing about nature in traditional way also, who were writing about the rural England or rural people. But basically, it was poetry of the city. So we find many references in poems where city is represented, and city was a very significant influence on poets also. The earlier, as we find in English poetry, particularly poets of England, in the early phase we find this. In Hardy and his contemporaries, in poetry as well as in general literature, in novel also, we find an awareness about the problems of city, about the alienation that this new lifestyle was causing to people. We find that in Hardy, etc. But more or less, in the earlier phase, this reference to city was more or less that of writing it off. That is, all right, it is there, but we write it off. We do not consider it very significant. And the writers and poets continued to ignore city. Gradually, there was this growing awareness about the pressures of modern life being exerting a tremendous influence on tremendous stress, we may say, on modern men, and that we find in the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century. So now the new life and the pressures, as I said, of new life were being reflected in the poetry of this period. So we shall go to the characteristics of the period first, and then we shall come to Eliot and we shall look at his life and time in which he wrote. These are some of the characteristics of modern poetry that are on your screen. abundance and variety. Of course, there was a lot of poetic output, and so many writers were writing. Some of them were still traditional. They were still writing in the traditional way, but some others like Eliot and others were very much experimental, and they were trying out new ways. They were exploring new avenues to express the new reality that was before them. There was not of revolt, realism, the traditional romantic idea of poetry as an escape to nature. That romantic idea there was a revolt against this romantic idea of life and romanticism in general. So that we find in this slide, and then delight in the sensuous depiction of beauty of nature. Some of the poets who referred to nature, or who sing in the praise of nature, they also depicted the sensuous, physical aspect of nature. For instance, nature is there in many of the poets. For instance, Robert Frost, American poet, we find nature fully expressed in his poems. But now the attitude to nature was different. There we do not find the kind of spiritualization of nature that we find in Wordsworth, or we may say the intellectualization of nature that we find in Shelley. It was purely physical, sensuous depiction of beauty of nature that we find in the poetry of the 20th century. Humanitarianism, the growing awareness about the society surrounding the poet. The poet did not live in an ivory tower, completely cut off from the day-to-day reality. He was aware, and he was concerned, and he felt the agony, the pity of the common man, the suffering of the common man appealed to the poet, and he wrote poetry about this suffering, about these problems. So he was humanitarian. He felt a need to write about the sufferings of the common man. And then we shall see in the slide that some more characteristics. Disillusionment, as I said, disillusionment. This is a significant term. So many factors were working towards this disillusionment. It was a slow and gradual process in the Western civilization. For instance, so many thinkers of different disciplines influenced the life in a very significant way. Hegel, Freud, Marx, so many writers. Hegel was a philosopher, Freud was a psychologist, and Marx was an economist, social economist. But all of them contributed to this sense of disillusionment. For instance, Darwin even, when he said that we are a stage in the process of evolution, he delivered a severe blow to our idea of ourselves. We are no longer sons of the God. We are no longer divine in any sense. We do not have any divine connection. We are no longer sons of the God. We are just a stage in evolution, just like any other animal. So all these writers, thinkers, they were delivering severe blow to man's idea of himself. And suddenly, man found himself without any ideology to rest his faith on. So he felt that he had nothing to cling to. So Matthew Arnold says, poetry will survive us. Poetry will support us. That is what he says in his critical writing. He looked for support. He looked for something to cling to in the form of poetry. But that was a poet's idea of it. More or less people felt this. So disillusionment in that sense. Science appeared to be very promising, but then later on we find that science, especially the World War, it shattered our idea of science, and people started feeling that science could be very destructive, and it can no longer hold and sustain mankind. So that disillusionment with the modern institutions of society, various institutions of society, for instance, democracy, judiciary, etc., so many things, laissez-faire or free economy, idea of free economy. It was believed that free economy would relieve mankind of all its ills, and then we realized that it has done exactly the reverse. So this was the disillusionment that was widespread, and that we find in the poetry of Eliot also. As we look in the slide, we shall see some of the poetry is religious. We shall see in detail how this we find religious element in T.S. Eliot's poetry also. Metaphysical. Donne's poems were republished in the second or third, I don't remember, second or third decade of the 20th century, and that rekindled the poet's interest in John Donne and his way, his method, his manner of writing poetry. So we find metaphysical element in the poetry of the 20th century. Symbolism, there was a romantic note also. As I said, there was a sense of revolt, and some of the poets were still writing in the traditional romantic note, in the sense that they were finding escapism from the everyday problems, and that escapism is a romantic note that we find in the 20th century poetry. There was this depiction of love, which is a perennial subject of romantic poets. So that we find in the 20th century poetry. And then there was experimentation. Vers libre, that is a French word that I have mentioned there, that means free verse. Poets were more and more experimenting with their content, with their method, with their content as well as manner. Poetry was undergoing a sea change. People were now taking liberty with the traditional forms of poetry. Meters were gradually loosening, and the rhythmical or rhyme scheme, they were gradually giving way to run-on lines. So many things were happening in the sphere of poetry, both, as I said, in content as well as in manner. So we find that idea of experimentation. T.S. Eliot's The West Land is the best example of the 20th century poets' desire to find a better instrument of expression of their reality that was different from the reality that earlier writers and poets were expressing. So that we find element of experimental tendency in the 20th century. And then there was the poetry was urban, as I said. More and more people were writing about the life in urban city life. One of the critics, I don't remember the name right now, has written an article, Metropolitan and Our Idea of Culture. So that metropolitan, or city as we call it, came into the center. As I said earlier also, gradually there was this tendency to neglect it. It's all right, city is there, but it doesn't bother me. And then gradually there was that awareness. The pressures were building up on the individual, and he had to recognize it, he had to reckon it. So earlier this was, there was a rejection. From rejection, this next stage was alienation. People, a man was finding himself alienated, rootless. He didn't have any identity in the city mass. The mass, the otherness of the mass was horrifying, terrifying, and the man was terrified. And that we find in the poetry of the modern age, and that we find in T.S. Eliot also. As I referred to the element of experimentation, and that we find in as I said, in content also. For instance, the jug of the machines, or the day-to-day routine, motor cars, horns, honking, traffic jams, this found expression in poetry. These subjects were formerly thought to be beyond poetry or outside poetry, but now the poets were writing about these aspects of human life. So a new reality was being expressed in the poetry during the 20th century. Before we go to the Westland, I think it would be pertinent to take a look at the dramas of T.S. Eliot's, plays of T.S. Eliot, and how he looks at drama. drama he wrote in the later phase of his life, and there is a sense of continuity. There is a sense of progression in the way T.S. Eliot had experimented with his form. Formerly he wrote poetry, and then he surprisingly he is better known as a poet today, but during the last 20 years of his career he did not write poetry at all, and he diverted his energy for drama. So poetry is an indirect form of expression. From there he switches over to drama, and he thought that he would need to have a medium that is more direct, more where he has a direct sort of communication with the reader. So there we find that. I have, as I said, Dr. Kinger with me, and he would now talk about the dramas of T.S. Eliot, and he would throw some light on the dramatic works of T.S. Eliot. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Pandya. I should skip the part of the introduction, but I'm tempted to pick up one thread that you left in between. Was that you mentioned that multifaceted personality as T.S. Eliot was. I'm here to draw a kind of analogy. I personally feel that versatility, multifacetedness is a kind of a rarity, and literary versatility is still more rarer. And in the Orient, we find an example in the name of Sri Rabindranath Tagore, a poet laureate of 1913. And to equate that experience, we can find a parallel in the name of, say, T.S. Eliot, who was also a poet laureate of 1948. A poet, a critic, a dramatist, all bundled into one. Yeah. And I'm here to dwell on his dramas, but that would not suffice. And therefore, I have chosen a title that is T.S. Eliot, a playwright at par with his poetry. You can see that on the slide. A playwright at par with his poetry. So while evaluating Eliot's works, we come across a lot of poetry in his drama also. And while studying his drama, we are not far from poetry. Of course, his contribution in criticism, his contribution in poetry is much talked about, but his drama, his singular fame rests with one drama, Murder in the Cathedral. I feel that he was a church's favorite son. Church solicited his help in bringing about religiosity among people. So he wrote a few drama on the calling of a church. For instance, The Rock, Murder in the Cathedral. These two were the prominent examples of drama written after the request of the church, Catholic Church especially. So here, in these two plays, they are also written in verse form. And in these two plays, he dwells upon the themes of religiosity, spiritualism, the meanings of human existence and death. And he calls upon people to look on those issues in a different manner. These two plays were much discussed about among the people. But then after his plays, The Family Reunion, The Cocktail Party, The Confidential Clerk, and The Elder Statesman, these plays are also very famous, and it's a rich corpus of literature, we may say, even in the realm of drama, the genre drama. They are very near to the poetry. Of course, the later plays, The Family Reunion, The Cocktail Party, they look much mundane. Their appeal is little bit commercial. a kind of commercial appeal is there to entertain people at large. These are the issues discussed, modern issues, as earlier Professor Pandya discussed, that urban issues are there. Most of his dramas deal with urban issues, the meanings of death, the meanings of existence. All these dramas, they discuss religiosity at length. So these later part dramas, Confidential Clerk, The Elder Statesman, they are much more, they have the thrust on the, mundane, materialistic life. And I think Eliot, as he excels in his poetry, as his fame is there with the wasteland, Ash Wednesday, we may say, the same issues, the same kind of things are discussed in a dramatic genre. The final appeal of all these dramas, maybe there is ash in the wasteland, but we also hear that human being is ending not with a bang but in a whimper. All these things are there. But of course there is a kind of hope where he says in the wasteland as Shanti, Shanti, Shanti or Datta Dvaidvam. So I think he takes his drama to the height of poetry as well. He lifts the scenario of the drama where a layman as well as the elite of literature, they both understand the meanings, the religiosity at par. And he has used this medium to discuss all these things very nicely. So today's thrust is poetry itself, and therefore I am here to dwell on the drama, but there is not much time for all the discussions that may issue afterwards. But I would request now again Professor Pandya and Professor Kakkar.
I was just wondering if we may say that his dramas are a logical extension of his creative urge that is reflected in poetry in the earlier part.
True.
And then he finds this medium of drama more direct and pertinent. So he reverts to drama. And his dramas, as you said, are poetic drama. They are an extension of his poetic practice. So in that sense, there is a clear progression that we find in the literary career of T.S. Eliot. One more thing that you
One
say.
thing I should mention here
Yes.
is that he had a very fine ear for music.
Yes.
And he was much attracted to jazz kind of music. And
Yes.
Sweeney is outcome of that jazz thing, jazz music. And he uses this medium in all of his dramas because his drama are written in verse. He tries to lift it to the modicum of jazz, to the level of jazz, and he tries to give that, he sound that kind of music to the public at large.
Yes. So that melody we find in his poetry also, and that we find in his drama. So same strain runs throughout his literary career. And one more thing that I was talking about, and that you referred to in your talk, is that there is a progression. As you said, religious element in the earlier plays, and then that concern for spiritual barrenness. That we find a clear progression right from the beginning to the end in the literary career of T.S. Eliot. Earlier, in the earlier part of his career, there seems to be a sort of pessimism. And the Westland is an example of his pessimistic view, where he finds that there is no hope of resurrection for the Western European civilization. And then gradually he progresses to a state of mind where he thinks that yes, there may be some possibility of resurrection. And in his plays we find that that expression of his of that hope for resurrection for modern men. So from an agnostics that we find in the earlier part of his career to a religious believer, and then in his plays we definitely find that Eliot is now converted, a different person altogether. That steady gradual development, progression, we can very well notice in the in the course of his literary career. In the earlier part, for instance, in Love Song of J. Prufrock, we find that the protagonist is not able even to articulate his question, to articulate his doubt. He is frustrated, and he doesn't dare to, we may say, articulate his doubt, and he hesitates, and he never succeeds in it. Then the next stage comes in the Westland. The protagonist is able to articulate, face the eternal problem, the eternal dilemma, and then we find this development, progression, and ultimately the religious place. So from agnostics to a believer, that kind of progression we find in T.S. Eliot. We have to hurriedly move to the another part of his of our talk, and that is Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I have with me Professor Bansri Ben Kakkad, and she will throw light on Alfred Prufrock.
When we refer the title, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, it comes.
Yes.
Yes. So the poem was, we find in the collection of Prufrock and Other Observations. The year is 1917, and we refer the title. We may say that unconsciously T.S. Eliot might have chosen the title. That is from a furniture wholesaler firm where he was born and bred. He might have. And another source is, that is in a short story, the reference of that Prufrock. That story is written by Henry James, where the description of the man is, he is a middle-aged man. T.S. Eliot has also portrayed the man here. He is in his 40s, or at least he wears clothes as if he is in his 40s. As the title is The Love Song, there is neither the love nor the song. And we see that when he thinks to offer, or when he wants to propose, he is not able to propose the lady. In the end of the poem too, we see that he is recalling his past, where he was quite young. He had been there at the seashore, and he had seen so many beautiful girls and mermaids, but now no more is there. So recalling of the past is there, but we see together that he is indecisive, and he has not that much of the courage to propose. So as we have referred, gradual progression. In this poem, the hero is quite unheroic. While as we have referred the drama by T.S. Eliot, we see Harry from the family reunion. He finally decides to have his spiritual pilgrimage. Here we see no reference of the spiritual pilgrimage is there. The only thing is that man is able to do nothing. Though we live in the modern age, ours is the modern civilization, but man is actually unable to do what he wants to do, and at the age of 40 he finds that he is capable of doing nothing, he can do nothing, and this here has been expressed by T.S. Eliot in this poem. The words J. Alfred might have been added by T.S. Eliot. Prufrock is the name, but J. Alfred, I think it is harsh and has been added by T.S. Eliot.
So, Madam, as it is shown in the slide, and you rightly suggested that it is an interior monologue, as it is shown on the slide.
Yes.
So, technique-wise, T.S. Eliot is using this technique of interior monologue, and thereby using the stream of consciousness in his
we may
in
say,
his poem, and in this way giving expression to the weariness, regret, embarrassment, frustration, emasculation, hopelessness, decay that this protagonist faces, I think. So that is the
Even in the beginning, when
Yes.
it has been addressed, you and I.
Yeah.
You means not the other person. It is Prufrock himself, and we may say other. He has divided himself into two.
yes.
No totality is there. That is also mentioned in the very beginning of the poem.
Yes, very right. So the poem is an earlier attempt. It comes in the earlier phase of his poetic career, and as it is shown on the slide, 2-3 things are mentioned there: a complete break from the 19th century tradition, a revolutionary poem, its title is ironic, and an interior monologue.
So it's a portrait of failure, and it's not of a one person only. It's this Prufrock is the image of the everyman in modern civilization, especially in Europe.
Yes, very right. So, by the time when Eliot was writing Prufrock, as I said, he was the progression that I was talking about, that we find here in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And we find this hesitance, we find this embarrassment in the protagonist, and he even refuses to face, to utter, to articulate the problem, the dilemma, and he fails to do that. So that utter frustration resulting out of this inability is what we call the modern man's dilemma. And Prufrock's physical handicap becomes a sort of burden for him, which he cannot carry nor cast off, and that we find in the poem. But this is the beginning of Eliot's manifestation of modern man's problem.
Burden in the sense that trivial activities he can do,
Yes.
but when it is the time to face, he feels that he has now grown old. Grown
Yes.
old means he can do nothing,
Yes, yes.
and there he is a failure.
Yeah.
So the poem focuses on the failure of the modern man.
Yes, failure of the modern man. And as you rightly said, this modern man is a representative of the modern civilization. And Eliot finds this acute sense, acute perception of decay in the modern civilization. And he feels and he gives voice to this hopelessness, that there is no resurrection for this modern civilization. It is doomed to perish, as if T.S. Eliot wishes to say. The same thing we find in the Westland also, where he...
just a moment.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, please.
But can we relate all these things of sense of alienation, sense of loss, or perishability, or whatever?
Yeah,
Can we relate all these things to his dual identity?
yeah,
Once he is American,
Yeah.
at other times he is a British.
yeah,
So this conflict between the identity itself, the Eliot identity, that vibrates between these two cultures,
yes,
say a pandemonium-like movement it is.
yes, movement.
So can we relate all these things to his conflict in the identity?
Yes, very well. You rightly suggested that he was an American emigre. He came to England and settled there.
Where
has
his
a significant-
ancestors had been there.
yeah, and has a significant relevance to his literary career. You rightly pointed out, Dr. Kinger, that
And I think he is in search of.
he is in search of, and that is, in another sense, many other poets were there, for instance Ezra Pound, etc., who fled from America, because America especially felt that rootlessness, that sense of being without roots, more than England did. England still had a countryside that was vibrant and living, and it was not under the stress of metropolitan life. Whereas America was totally at loss when it comes to having roots. So T.S. Eliot
I
said many
remember
other-
somewhere
yes.
he has said that my mind is American, whereas my heart is purely British.
Purely British.
So,
yes.
it has a kind of inbuilt conflict in it.
Yes, yes.
And this mistaken identities, I
Yes.
think that leads him to this kind of pessimism,
Yeah.
despair, hopelessness, and all these things.
And just about the time he wrote Prufrock, and immediately after that, he had a nervous breakdown, and he had to be treated for nervous breakdown. He had to take a leave of 3 months and go for treatment. So that period of nervous breakdown was caused by, as I said, by this acute pressure of the environment on him, and it was also caused by his personal circumstances. His own marriage was not very successful. He found the marriage incompatible, and he had problems with his wife. And in T.S. Eliot's in the Westland, we find that his wife was suffering from neurotic problems, and Eliot was under tremendous pressure because of that. So that sense of fruitlessness, that sense of frustration that Professor Kakkad referred to, probably originated from this.
So we may say that his poems are the record of his personal history.
Yes,
to some extent.
that is a very significant and relevant point, especially with Eliot, because Eliot advocated a theory of poetry where he emphasized impersonality of the poet. He said, poetry is not a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is not a vehicle to express our emotions. Rather, it is a vehicle to get rid of emotions, to free ourselves from...
instead of feelings, rather the thought governs his poetry.
Yeah, intellectual element is there. But
purely intellectual.
But
And
this-
other no hero we find in his poems.
Yes,
Or
yes.
if the hero is there, he is quite unheroic.
Yeah, hero. That is the depiction of a modern man. This unheroic hero is typically modern phenomenon. Typically
Ulysses.
modern. Yeah.
James Joyce,
That we
Ulysses.
find in James
Right.
Joyce, and Eliot was tremendously influenced by James Joyce. So in many other writers also we find this unheroic hero, because modern man is no longer the protagonist that we find during the Elizabethan period. Tall, towering personality, they have disappeared because modern man is no longer free. He is just a puppet in the hands of forces which are beyond his control. So that unheroic hero is typically modern, and that we find, as Professor Kakkad rightly referred to, that we find in Eliot.
And
I
impact
was
of 2 world wars too.
yeah, First World War had a tremendous impact on Western mind in general, Western life in general, and people realized the destructive power of mankind. The destructive power of mankind. It was the worst war in the history of mankind so far. Of course, Second World War was
And he
worse
had been
than
the
that.
eyewitness
But so
of
far,
it.
First World War was the worst war that mankind had seen. So mankind, for the first time, came face to face with the brutality, with the terror of man's ability to destroy itself.
Beyond imagination.
Beyond imagination. So that was the point. But what I was referring to before we came to that is, I will read a very brief quotation because it is very important when we talk about T.S. Eliot. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, he says, but an escape from emotions. So whether T.S. Eliot's poetry and his drama are personal in the sense that they express his personal emotions or not, that is a different thing altogether. And then he said, it is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. That's what he says. It is an escape from personality. So, in this sense, we find that his poetry is the Westland and his plays, Prufrock even.
For quartets.
They are examples of his theory of poetry. What he says in his theory of poetry is this, that the the experience may be personal, but the poet has to present it in such a way that it does not remain personal. That impersonality, that is the cornerstone of Eliot's theory of criticism, theory of poetry. And in this sense, though there are so many instances, so many allusions in T.S. Eliot, where we find that his personal life, his personal anguish, his personal frustration is reflected. But at the same time, Eliot has been able to transcend this personal element and turn it into something that becomes impersonal and objective. And now we go to the Westland as the slide shows. We are running out of time, so we shall have to hurry up and go through this slide as soon as possible. The poem is divided into 5 parts: the burial of the dead, a game of chess, the fire sermon, death by water, and what the thunder said. And these 5 parts of the poem, they deal with different themes. What is the theme of the Westland, we may say? What is Westland? Westland is Westland of religion, where spiritual barrenness is found, and Eliot feels that Western civilization, European civilization, has become barren. There is no possibility, as he says in the poem, what roots clutch. In the poem he says, the plain is rocky, so there is no possibility of any spiritual regeneration in the Western civilization. So one theme, we shall see if time permits in detail how these themes are treated in the Westland. So it is a Westland of spiritual or religious kind, and then Westland of fertility. Now, fertility myth, we must draw our students' attention to this, that there is a fertility myth associated with the fisher king, and that is associated with the myth of Holy Grail. Myth of Holy Grail. And Holy Grail, holy means, and Grail is the bowl in which Christ had his last supper before he was crucified. So that Holy Grail and quest for Holy Grail has been a part of a myth in Western civilization. In this quest, there comes a region, there comes an area ruled by fisher king, and this area was cursed, had a cruel curse that nothing would grow there. It would remain barren forever. And similar curse fell on fisher king also, and he was rendered unable to procreate. So the fisher king's inability to procreate and the region's barrenness, they were the part of this fertility myth. Then a knight takes up the journey and reaches to Chapel Perilous, from where he can bring fertility back to this region. So that myth is used here in the Westland, that this Western civilization is spiritually barren, and there is no hope of any regeneration, and there is no one, not a knight, who can go to the Chapel Perilous and bring back fertility to it. We find numerous references to this in the Westland. There are characters, and all these characters, there are some women characters, there are some male characters. Both of them, both the groups, they represent this theme of barrenness and lack of fertility, and that sterility that is depressing. And love and sex, they find reflection in the Westland also, in association with this theme of sterility and fertility. And Eliot believes that in the modern civilization, love and sex are no longer holy or divine activity leading to procreation. They have become mechanical, they have become depressing, and they rob men of its spiritual height. So that is how he deals with this theme of spiritual barrenness. And then there is a sense of futility of the existence of modern man. He could not find an answer that can satisfy the modern man. So that we find the sense of futility and lack of order or anarchy prevailing in the Western civilization. We are running terribly short of time, and it is indeed very difficult to do justice to Eliot in a single session, because each of his work, be it Prufrock or the Westland or the plays that four quartets, we wanted to talk about four quartets also, but we are very sorry, we are terribly running short of time. And Professor Kinger and Professor Kakkad, thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Hope the students enjoyed it, and we shall meet again, and we shall try to arrange for another talk on the Westland
and four quartets.
Where we can do full justice to both these poems. As you also can see, we were running in full steam, and even then we could not complete the our discussion of the Westland and four quarters. But anyways, thank you, friends, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.